All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming here and attending our second out of the lab session with James Jones and Claude Steele. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction of our distinguished guests and then give them plenty of time to talk more about themselves. It's better to hear their history from them than from me. So I'm sorry, my name is Kelsey Harris, and I'm just going to be moderating this session for today. So Dr. Jones is a Trustees Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Psychological and Brain Sciences and Africana Studies, and the director of the Center for the Study of Diversity at the University of Delaware. Dr. Jones's research program has focused on racism, temporal orientation, and its influence on personality and the personality orientations of Black Americans that evolved from African origins, and which represent adaptations to the challenges of oppression, marginalization, and discrimination in the United States. He's perhaps best known for his seminal book, Prejudice and Racism, that was first published in 1972, had a second edition in 1997, and then a follow-up book called The Psychology of Diversity, Beyond Prejudice and Racism, that was published in 2014. Dr. Jones has served on several editorial boards, including the Journal of Black Psychology, and is a past president of the Society of Experimental Social Psychology and the Society of the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Thanks. Dr. Claude Steele is a professor of psychology at Stanford University. He's best known for his work on stereotype threat and its application to the minority student academic performance. His earlier work dealt with research on the self, as well as roles of self-regulation and addictive behaviors. He's elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Board, the National Academy of Education, and the American Philosophical Society. And he served on several major academic leadership positions, including being a former president of SPSP. So I'll let them take it away. And we'll start with our first question for James. What drew you to social psychology and how did you come to study race?
Thank you, Kelsey, and thanks the committee for organizing this. It's going to be good fun. Claude and I have been thinking about it for a while. I just see Hazel came in and Hazel said, be sure to tell them how much fun and how much you enjoy social psychology. So I do have fun. I have enjoyed social psychology. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to have had this career. I also was thinking about the fact that Claude and I collectively between us represent over 100 years of social psychology. And we both are smiling and laughing and enjoying it still. We have a lot of parallels, Claude and I do. And one of them, surprisingly for many people, is that both of our grandfathers were born into slavery. Mine in 1856 and Claude's in 1862. And it's remarkable that here we are in this time dealing with issues that in many respects are not completely different from the ones that our grandparents faced. I went to Oberlin College. I majored in psychology. I worked with Norman Henderson in his behavioral genetics lab, running the rats and the mice and in open field mazes and so on. I really enjoyed, that was my first exposure to science. And I loved wearing a lab coat and being a scientist. I said, I really like this. But mice and rats, that didn't work for me. I then got a job working for the Franklin Institute Research Laboratories in Philadelphia as a human factors psychologist. We studied air traffic controllers and developed displays and did experiments to show which displays were most effective in conveying information in high pressure situations. This was in the era of Vietnam, so we were doing work that was relevant to the war. In fact, my first publication ever was in the Journal of Applied Psychology, which Decision Quality as a Measure of Visual Display Effectiveness. I still remember the title. I got a master's at Temple during the time I was in Philadelphia and worked with Tom Shipley in his research on Skid Row residents and personality factors that made it more or less likely that they would escape Skid Row. That was kind of interesting. A colleague of mine at Franklin Institute and I did a kind of a new look in perception study, looking at the perceived size of coins to show how much value affected perception. That was fun. We published that. And then, and this is Claude and I coming back together. I read an article in the New York Times Magazine by Ken Clark, which described his work in Harlem and ultimately became Dark Ghetto, which was the book that represented that work. And I said, I want to be like Ken Clark. In fact, I want to be Ken Clark. So I decided I would apply to graduate programs in social psychology to become Ken Clark. I went to Yale. I got into Yale, and turns out I was the first Black graduate student they had ever had. In spite of the fact that Phil Zimbardo was perceived by people at Yale to be Black when he applied. And he was perceived to be Black because he ran track and liked jazz. So he claims, sort of jokingly, that he was the first Black graduate student at Yale, but in fact, I was. So I just want the record to be straight.
I'm going to take that message to Phil.
So to fast forward, right? To fast forward, during my third year, Chuck Keister was my advisor, and he was editing a series for Addison Westing in social psychology, and he asked me to write a book on prejudice. I said, I don't know, I haven't even started my dissertation yet, but I was game. That's kind of the way I am. I do whatever I think is fun, maybe to do. So I said, okay. And so I arrived at Harvard, their first Black faculty member in psychology also, to begin writing this book. And the book was a psychology of prejudice. I didn't feel as though at that time, this is 1970, at that time, what was going on in the country was not reflecting what I felt I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about race. I wanted about racism. I wanted to understand what was going on. I wanted to understand how we got here, what it meant, and what we could do about it, and how our work related to it. So I explained to Chuck that I was having trouble with the title. I said, well, change it, which would seem like a very simple thing to do. So I changed the title and became Prejudice and Racism. So I'm going to stop there. I'll come back to talk more about the content of what I did, but I wanted to say that was the beginning of my career, and that kind of got me established as in a way that allowed me to talk about what I felt, what I observed, what I experienced, and to connect it to the field in ways that combined, thinking about problems, issues, perspectives, and determining what in our work, in our field, connected to it in useful ways. So I'll ask Claude, same question. How'd you get into this field, man?
I would say it's a very parallel set of steps, and even in the same part of the country, my little college was what, I don't know, 30 miles from Oberlin, Hiram College. And I too took care of the rat lab. And I like psychology for some reason, which is still a bit mysterious to me, but it just fit. I kind of knew it right away. This is a good place for me. But like you, the behaviorism of the day was, I don't know, it allured me, but it wasn't going to be.
Right.
It was reading about social psychology, reading Roger Brown's textbook in social psychology in the 60s that really was exciting. The field was only, at that time, only about 20 years old, really, in a meaningful way. It's a post-World War II science. And it just seemed like this, it was just beginning to flower in the mid late 60s. And it seemed like this is a place you could plant your life, that you could have a career here. So I never had ambivalence about it, about being in the field. And by and large, it's always been that way. I mean, we've had tons of crises and traumas in the field, all kinds of ups and downs and arounds and the bend. But basically, I think it's a good piece of real estate.
Yeah.
It's a good set of problems and a good to work on, and a good set of it's a perspective as a science, a level of analysis. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say, that I enjoy living in that at that level. So I was fortunate enough to get into Ohio State down the road from my college at a time when that program was just galvanizing as a rigorous social psychology program. I don't know if they thought we had a lot of talent, but they thought they could make us into soldiers of the discipline, of the science. We could learn methods. You had to, for example, you had to have a minor in statistics that was required if you were in social psychology. So I'm grateful for that. I too wanted to be, it was Kenneth Clark, right? He had accomplished so much. He was famous in the African-American community. His research had undergirded the desegregation decision, the Supreme Court desegregation decision. He was such a cool guy. I thought it was an inspiration. I applied to work with him in graduate school, and apparently they lost my application. They didn't. So they admitted me in the summer. They found it. They admitted me in the summer. And my undergraduate advisor said, "No, you're already committed. You got to go to Ohio State." And I think it's a good thing, actually.
Yeah, right.
Looking back on it, I think that training there it's been really important to me. But that's how I got into the business.
I should add for both of us that although I never actually worked with Ken Clark, I did go to school with his daughter, Kate, and she was a classmate of mine at Oberlin. But I also ended up writing his obituary for the American Psychologist. So I did have those connecting moments. There's a question about what the field was like when we came into it, and how did we situate our work in the field. I know you had multiple careers in your work. It'd be interesting to know how you ended up where you may be most well known for from where you started.
Well, the study. There was no study of race in those days. I remember having an introductory social psych course at Ohio State, in which the professor, which will go unnamed, we don't study race. And he gave an example. He said he had a student during the summer who drove an ice cream truck, and he kept track of the flavors that white people and black people ordered when they ordered ice cream from his truck. And black people ordered vanilla, and white people ordered chocolate. And he said, so you can see it's ridiculous to study race, because who knows how to interpret that? What would that be? What would that be about? And so it was offered as an example right at the beginning of the course that unless you've got a deeper theory, his defense of his position is unless you've got a deeper theory that would explain something, then just don't go there. It's not just it's not sort of an actuarial science. It's a science in pursuit of a theory of understanding. And so unless you understand something about race, don't get into it. And that was same view for gender, same. So the field was kind of stranded on a set of issues that were, I think a lot of us felt were important and not being attended to, not being focused on. And that you had to defend yourself if you did focus on it. You had to make a case for that.
I have a similar, different but similar kind of experience when I was in graduate school at Yale. Experimental social psychology was really burgeoning. And we were, Chuck was a student of Leon Fessinger's, and he was the most rabid experimentalist you could imagine. And one of the students, one of my colleagues, I had a great time. I loved all my fellow students, but I remember him saying, we're not interested in people. We're interested in variables. And race is not a variable. So that was really, I mean, I still remember it. It's very illuminating for me. And I know what they meant, you know, the idea that you can't manipulate race. Well, in fact, we do in a variety of ways, but the idea was that you can't manipulate race, therefore you can't study. It's kind of like the ice cream story. But for the most part, the work in the early years was about discrimination. There were kind of two strands. One was what makes people prejudiced. And so there's a fair amount of work done on that. And the other side was how do we understand the low self-esteem and self-hatred of Black people? And which was, interestingly, Ken Clark kind of furthered that idea, I believe, in fact, I'm almost certain, in part because it was a way to show how unfair segregation was. But the work in the field either was about low self-esteem of Blacks or racial prejudice of whites. And for me, I felt that those approaches were too individualistic and that we really needed to have an understanding of what really made people who they were and how they thought and how they acted and what drove them beyond who they were, but what socialized them, what did they respond to in their context and their environment that made them have those attitudes and behave the way they did. And so the notion of institutional racism grew in '68 with a couple of books on institutional racism and the Kerner Commission report on racism as responsible for the riots of the late '60s. And so institutional racism was important because it took us beyond the notion of intentionality in individual behavior and said, if institutions behave in a way that produces unfair and unequal outcomes, that's institutional racism, whether that was the intention or not. And so when you remove intention, you remove the individuality of responsibility, and you are able to look at results as opposed to intentionality or motive. And so that was important. But for me, the big piece, the most important piece was culture, because I felt like culture is what really drove the whole thing. The values, the beliefs, the attitudes, the privileging of European culture, of white culture, made everybody have to play catch up. You either went along with the program or you were an outlier. And I knew growing up that that was the case. We knew what the norms were. We knew what the values were. We knew what was supposed to be right and what was supposed to be wrong. We knew Father Knows Best as opposed to Amos and Andy. We knew all that. So how do we navigate a world in which we are looked at in an inferior way, and others are looked at in a superior way, and our only avenue was to become like them? And so integration became kind of the buzzword for how do you do it? And I didn't think that was sufficient to account for my experience, for what I cared about, what I knew other people cared about. So I was naive. I didn't know what I was doing when I wrote Prejudice. I really didn't. I just sat down and said, let me write about something I think is important and something I have some feelings about, and let me connect it in whatever way I can to the literature. So that's what I did. And I said, you can't understand 1970 race relations without looking at the historical antecedents to where we were right now. So history became a very important part. I wrote sections on history and the connection of what was going on in the world and the social science that was used to describe it, and how well they came together, or how well they diverged. So history continues to be and was a very important part, but it really was the idea that there's a scaffolding of culture, institutions, and individuals that reciprocally influence each other and that create a dynamic that evolves over time. And at that time, what I was writing about turns out to be very much like what we now talk about as systemic racism, and what Hazel talks about as a cycle, cultural cycle. So I think we're there, we're working on that dynamic. And that's where I think there's excitement, because there's movement, there's energy, there's possibility, and there's change. And that's what makes the work we do very exciting.
Yeah. Well, I was inspired by your book. We didn't know each other at the time, but I said, this dude wrote a book. Man, goodness. It was a book that captured a perspective that I could really relate to. So I was inspired by that book. At the time, I wasn't doing research on either prejudice or racism, but I of course always had that as a basic personal intellectual interest, and read everything. But it captured your book a perspective that I think is important. If you make a distinction between functioning as a scientist, as an observer of people, versus functioning as a scientist as putting yourself in the shoes of people, an actor, the actor's perspective. I can make that actor-observer distinction. Your book had an actor's perspective toward racism. It was like somebody experiencing it, and you could see it, and it made more sense to talk about systemic things than just to talk about, if you're looking at somebody, you see them, and you start explaining everything in terms of things about them, their prejudicial attitudes, and the field, the study of race was dominated by that observer's perspective. The whole deficit model is that perspective. You're trying to explain outcomes for a group of people, and you're looking at the group of people, and you use things about the group of people to explain the outcomes. But you're not putting yourself in the shoes of the people and seeing the world that they actually have to contend with. And that gives you a completely different explanation of things. And I wouldn't have been able to say anything like what I just said at that time. But I resonated to the perspective that from that perspective, systemic racism makes sense. I felt later on, how do stereotypes affect people? The legacy from Clark was that they get internalized, and then they're self-fulfilled when you're in a situation where they're relevant. That was the standing 20th century explanation of how stereotypes affect all groups, women, Jews, Blacks. That was the story. But if you're in the shoes of the people who are stereotyped, you see that you're not so much worried about whether you believe the stereotype. That's an issue, can be an issue, but it's that you got to deal with a world that believes the stereotype, and you're contending with the possibility of being seen that way and being treated that way. So that actor's perspective gives you a different theoretical account of how those ideas in the society affect individual behavior. And I think that's one of the things that having multiple perspectives in science, why it's so important, gives you different angles on theory, different angles on explanation. So I hope that's one of the things that this work brings to the field at large.
Well, I know you studied alcohol and alcoholism, and I guess self-affirmation was another area of study. How did you segue from those domains to stereotype threat and identity threat?
Yeah, the first almost 20 years of my career was in those areas, alcohol. Also from this perspective I just mentioned, well, what's it like to be drunk?
Were you a participant observer?
Let's don't just watch drunk people. Let's be drunk. See what the world is like, you know, and make sense of it that way. I think I offer it as a trick, a theoretical trick to come up with a different perspective than the dominant perspective, because the dominant perspective is the observer's perspective. And anyway, I was busy working on those things, but nursing these feelings underneath it all. And it was a move to Michigan, from the University of Washington to Michigan. And that program at that time, I have to say, was really so important to me, because it licensed giving up the research that you made your career on, and you could get grants on, and you could actually stop that and switch to another problem. People in that program did that. Bob Zients changed topics, and Hazel and Dick Nisbet, they changed topics all the time. So I felt like, wow, I have a license to do something else. So that was I think the groundwork that enabled it, the shift you point to. And then I just got a really good problem, which was this underperformance problem. People with the same preparation, if they're members of an ability stigmatized group, doing worse, even though they've got the same preparation. And you expect that finally they would do the same, but there's still this other issue here. And it turned out to be a lawful finding. And the pursuit of how to understand that, what caused that, which took some years before a term like stereotype threat around, seemed to capture what was going on. But it was the problem, just going to Michigan and being on a committee, seeing this problem, and that's something a social psychologist could understand. So that's how that happened.
So for me, it was, writing the book in 1970, it came out in 72. So last year was the 50th anniversary of its publication. Wow. But in 73, I got a Guggenheim grant to go to Trinidad. And my dissertation at Yale, I say I was the first Black graduate. There was nothing there to really advance my interest in becoming Ken Clark, except basic social psychological training, which is really why when I said, well, let me just get the best training I can, and then I'll do my thing. And that's pretty much what I did. But I got this Guggenheim to go to Trinidad, and in the context of writing about sports and style and improvisation and so on, and then going to Trinidad and observing Shango religious ceremonies and dance and carnival, and I saw these things coming together. And the phrase, that article I wrote about, titled "Any Time is Trinidad Time." So time was really kind of the linchpin for this whole set of characteristics that describe how you can live in a world and express basic human nature impulses and needs and desires in a cultural context that values and reinforces them. And that's where time, rhythm, improvisation, orality, spirituality, the trios idea emerged. And I've been writing about that for a while. And the antidote, or the juxtaposition, is with what I call that persistent sense of being a target of racism. And so on the one hand, you have this need to protect yourself from this hostile, toxic environment. And that self-protection is a very strong motive. But on the other hand, you have this need to express your humanity, who you are, what you believe in, and what makes you human, what things have meaning for you. And that's where trios comes in. So the combination of trios and this self-protective, what I call the universal context of racism, the idea that racism is ubiquitous and as always a possible explanation for what happens to you. It isn't always the explanation, but always could be an explanation. And then you have to figure out which one it is and what you're going to do about it. And so the motivation, the attitudes, the emotions that come with all of that, this juxtaposition of protecting and enhancing yourself is for me really a basic idea about being marginalized, minoritized, or whatever. You're struggling with those two polarities, and how you manage that really, I think, introduces some new ideas and approaches to the field. And I think stereotype threat also creates this kind of ambiguity, ambivalence that you have to marshal through. And if you do it correctly, you get stronger. If you don't, you may suffer.
So I'm just going to jump in with a question. So James, you mentioned being Yale's first true Black grad student and Harvard's first Black professor, and that your first book came out 50 years ago. So over the course of your career, how has your experience as a Black scholar, and specifically as a Black scholar studying race and racism, changed over time?
Well, as Claude has already said, we were one of few, or we were one of maybe 4 or 5 or 6 Black social psychologists. And I think we all had the same motivation we all were at, James was at Wayne State and then at Michigan. I was at Yale, then at Harvard, and so on. We all had the training, the basic training, but we all had this underlying desire to understand the world from the actor's perspective. And I call it the inside analysis as opposed to outside, same basic idea. And so for me, it was, how can I do what I do, understand what I need to understand, and to what extent does my training help me to do that? And I went to Harvard. It was 1970, and we had a very small number of Black faculty, and I don't know how this happened. I'm a young assistant professor, but I ended up as co-chair of the Association of Black Faculty at Harvard. And that was a way of connection. Harvard had just started the Afro-American Studies department in '69. So I had relationships with Ewer Grenier, Lonnie Grenier's father, who was chair of Afro-American Studies. And I also worked with Derek Bell and Sarah Lightfoot in developing the blueprint for what became the Du Bois Research Institute. And we were on the first board for that. So there was ways to have that connection that gave meaning to your practice. I also developed the, with colleagues, the Community Research Review Committee. And we decided that we were going to employ NIH standards to research in the Black community. And so people who want to do research in the Black community had to submit their proposals to us. We reviewed them and made a decision. And I remember famously, Jerry Kagan was doing work in Roxbury. And he was very good. He submitted his proposal. He didn't have to, but he did. He submitted his proposal. We reviewed it and we rejected it. And that was very, and he's a colleague, he's right down the hall from me. And then I had to go and sit in his office and explain that we did not support his proposal. But, that was what you did there. You had to find the space, create the space, create structures, and then activate them to achieve what you wanted. So that was the early stages. Everything was new. You were a pioneer in many respects. As time went on, the more and more people entered the field, and the field became more sophisticated. That may be too strong a word. Became more aware of issues. It was easier then to kind of talk. You had more people you could talk with in ways that were relevant or resonant for you. So by the end, you know, you get to be an elder, as I said earlier. And now you just, you know, kind of look out there and you see young faces, you see people of different backgrounds and colors and orientations. And you see that there is really a representation of what it means to be human. And you can now look out and say, okay, let's work together to figure out this thing about being human. And how do we use the discipline that we have, the training that we have, the perspective we have to do a better job of showing how it's possible to have a good human society and to be a participant in that. And so at this point, I can talk about a variety of different things, but the end goal is looking at things in a more positive, more expansive way. So it's much easier.
It's the same question to you, Claude.
Okay. I think, you know, this with life as an African-American psychologist, I want to say positive things. I think there's at one level, there are some advantages because you do have experiences that give you insights that you can draw on to contribute to the field. So I wouldn't want to diminish that in any way. And I want to put it in a positive light. I've always felt like the field was a great platform on which to have a life and to think about these issues, connect to these issues in a way that's contributed to the larger society. That it's a gift to be in this field in that respect. As the field has gotten more diverse, I think one thing diversity does is it can racialize all of us. It can make, as you come together, everybody's more aware of having an identity, and the whole phenomenon of identity and what that means becomes a much more central part of the field. So I think in these recent maybe decades, as the field has gotten more diverse, I mean, we've been in the field for like 5 decades or 5+ decades. And in the last couple, I feel the field has stepped up to some more important issues. And you know, it's always possible for a science to go down rabbit holes. I think diversity makes it harder to do that because there are more perspectives that come together. And so I feel very encouraged about that. I mean, we have our challenges. I'm going to, you know, use the term research hygiene, if I can use that term. Research hygiene is a necessity. It's not a sufficiency. It's a necessity, but it's not a sufficiency. We have to take the lessons that we learn from our various eras of concern about research hygiene, take those lessons, pre-registration and the like, and do them. But then we got to get down to the real work of understanding social phenomena and the challenges, the work that the society needs us to do in its behalf. We have a role, a responsibility there. So I feel, I guess I don't want to go on. There are challenges, you know, at a personal level, at a career level. You're trying to persuade people of things they don't see. And the stakes can be high and the stress can be high. So I don't want to be in denial of any of that. But I also think it's a tremendous opportunity to contribute in this field. It's an exciting opportunity to way to contribute to society.
Thanks. So I have a couple more questions before we finish up today. So as you're kind of talking about your combined 100 years of experience in social psych, you've had lots of time to see how the field has moved and changed and gone down rabbit holes and maybe been pulled out of rabbit holes. So what do you both see as maybe the future of the field, or where would you kind of like to see social psych head?
Well, I think I would just wind up repeating myself. I do think the field and science, as it has diversified, has taken on more important problems, more important challenges. And sometimes we don't see that because of that. You need that perspective to see that. But I definitely have that as a conviction. I think that's going to continue to happen. And I think the field and the outside world, just outside of our little club room of a science, people want to know what we were. They want to know what we know. They need to know, have answers to basic questions. So I've seen a lot of that. And I feel that there's therefore space and opportunity for our field and our science that I put my faith in the future, and I think we'll continue to meet it. I think we'll get better and better as a science. Again, I don't want to be naive about frustrations and challenges, but I think that's where we're going to go. And the fact that still a lot of people want to be social psychologists. Mm-hmm. So I rest my confidence in the future on those things.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier about the multidimensionality, and I think diversity is one aspect of that multidimensionality. And I think the multidimensionality requires or enables us or demands that we look at things complexly. And we tend to avoid that. And when I was growing up in social psychology, a 2x2 predicted interaction, that was social psychology. It was so simple, so naive in some respects, but it was decent science. It wasn't, we could never survive. Some of the studies were published in the 60s would never make it today. But I think that multidimensionality, which is what I saw when I began Prejudice and Racism, is now expanded into the diversity argument about multiple perspectives. So it's both multiple disciplines, multiple perspectives, multi-methods, and all that makes everything more complicated. But that's the world we live in. And I think that as we become more complicated in how we approach it, we're able to grapple with more complicated questions and hopefully make some progress with that. One of the particular areas I think is important, particularly now, is the notion of history, which was a very important part of how I approached the initial version of Prejudice and Racism. But we now are dealing with a very strange notion of what is the relevance of history. I've learned about this word that's being used now, presentism. The idea that we're looking at the past through the lens of the present. And the people who propose this presentism idea are really suggesting that that's flawed, that's wrong. But I think you have to look at the past through the lens of the present, but you also look at the present through the lens of the past. So we can call that pastism, I guess. But we need to look at it both directions. And I think that will unlock a lot, because we are different in part because of our history, our different cultural trajectories, our different developmental trajectories. So the differences come from historical circumstances. So we need to understand, how do we think about the past, our individual past, our collective past, our cultural past? How do we think about it? How do we understand it? And how do we make sense of who we are now from that vantage? So I think that, for me, that's the future that's very exciting, very complicated, but I think we have the arsenal and the people to really do a good job with that.
Well, I'm excited to hear that, man, because maybe it's an old man's thing. I don't know, but history seems like it's an actual variable.
Right.
And because history has put us, based on our identities, into different roles and different relationships with us. And when we interact it together, a lot of the tension that can be there, or some of the tension that can be there, is a tension coming from history. We're having to contend with, as an African American in a let's say a diverse context, we're having to contend with how people could see us and what they think about our preparation and ability. We're dealing with that that's history.
Mhm.
If we're in a different society with a different history, that wouldn't be there. And if you're white in a situation like that, you have to contend with the role history has put you in. You could be seen as a racist, and you could be linked to a very dark past. And so a lot of the tension between us has to do with history as an actual
Absolutely.
Psychological reality that we're contending with in a situation. And I think diversity makes that more clear and more obvious to us.
All right, and just to conclude, what advice do you have, sorry, for any young researchers that might help them have a long and fruitful career?
My advice is to believe in yourself and have confidence in your ability and the relevance of your approach to the issues that matter to you. You do your best work when you do things that are of intimate, Paul Tillich, the religious philosopher, intimate and ultimate concern. That's where you get your energy, your inspiration. And I think if you do that, you don't go down rabbit holes trying to get tenure doing things that you think will help you get tenure. You do things that matter to you, you do them well, and you feel fulfilled, and the rest of it follows. So I would say, do that.
Me too. Persistence.
Yeah.
Endurance, resilience, persistence. Follow follow your instinct, trust your instincts and your insights, and be persistent.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you to James and Claude for giving their history and wisdom. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your conference. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.